Good morning. Thanks everyone for attending the session. I'll probably wander around a little bit. Integration tends to not be the most interesting of topics, particularly right before lunch. So we'll see if I'm able to hold your attention for the better part of an hour. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how when integration, which is a problem that's existed forever, and cloud intersect, how do things change? You know, how do some of the norms of the way we think about addressing integration problems change? And the goal of this is really just to sort of give you some things to sort of go away and think a little bit more about as you're sort of mapping out how integration might impact your business. You know, I always like to start these conversations by trying to level set everybody on why are we actually moving to the cloud? What are we actually trying to do? Because I think we can easily be misled by vendors that might have different agendas and sort of, you know, short-sighted publications. You know, the way I always think about it is that this is the world that we live in today. And we live in this world for a lot of reasons. Integration is one of the big reasons we live in this world. And it is this situation that is driving us to make an extreme change, because cloud is an extreme change. It's not a step change. And I personally have the view that we haven't been doing cloud for the last 30 years. I think it does fundamentally change IT. With that brings a lot of challenges and problems. So I'm not the cloud fanboy by any means, but I do want to state it for what it is. It's a big change. And most companies are at some phase of thinking about cloud as part of their IT strategy. But I don't think cloud is about taking an asset and moving it into a different data center. Taking some application that was running here and now it's running there in the magical cloud. I think it's more about enabling IT organizations to be agile, in short, and the way they do that is going the next layer or two up the stack. Beyond, you know, OSs running in the cloud, I think it's also about the applications and ultimately the business processes that are enabled through the cloud. So this is our real goal, is what I would assert to you, that we're trying to get away from. Integration comes up time and time again as organizations begin thinking about their cloud strategy. And one of the reasons that happens is because every company has some integration strategy already. Everyone in this room has had to deal with integration, either firsthand or secondhand. And the first thing that we try to do is we try to look at our current strategy and our current assets, and we even try to make them work. And we quickly realize that they won't. And I'm going to kind of talk about why that is. But it is something that's top of mind. It sits up there with security and perceptions around lack of customization and perceptions around privacy and controls as being a real problem. And again, I want to kind of dig into that why. You know, Gartner talks a lot about, in their predictions, that application integration will increase both in scope and complexity, and that cloud is a driver behind that. Organizations will leverage both on-premise traditional integration as well as what Gartner now calls integration platform as a service, which they're putting under the umbrella of PaaS, or platform as a service. You know, IT is going to continue to include integration as a sort of a core part of their budget ask each year. Similarly, the recommendations to sort of respond to that is a recommendation to expand integration skills to address kind of the three big domains of integration: application to application, B2B, and cloud integration. And I'll talk more about those domains and what's kind of happening there as well. And ensuring that the iPaaS strategy favors the adoption of offerings that will fit or allow you to augment your current investments. Rarely do companies rip out overnight, those integration products. In a lot of cases, those integration middleware technologies are kind of the last thing to go as you move to the cloud because they literally touch everything. So with that as kind of the backdrop, these are the things that we've sort of observed. As I mentioned, as John mentioned, Boomi's been a company that's been focused on solving integration. I spend a lot of time just listening to customers talk about their challenges, and it's kind of crystallized into a couple of core areas that I want to talk to you about that again says, how is cloud kind of fundamentally changing some of these traditional integration norms. The first one is domain convergence, and so historically you had ETL, or data integration, you had application integration, also known as EAI, cousins with service-oriented architectures or enterprise service buses that would enable a service-oriented architecture. And then you had B2B integration, which is perhaps the oldest of the three, but that's where you talk about EDI and how you connect to suppliers or retailers or logistics providers. And those have historically been very separate domains, with vendors addressing them separately. And what's happening is customers are wanting to have one holistic solution. Now, that's kind of an obvious statement, right? Because as a customer, of course, we'd want to spend the least amount of money and get the most amount of stuff. But if you dig into why that domain convergence is happening, it's because of some of these other trends I'm going to talk about. What used to be a classic ETL problem, for example, is changing. What used to be a classic EAI or application integration problem is now changing. And one of the fundamental reasons that happens is because your applications and services that used to reside behind the firewall are now all over the place. Classic ETL deals with integrating with databases. Well, in the cloud, you don't get to connect to the database. You're connecting to an API. You're connecting to a web service, and so there's some changes. This is Gartner's attempt to make you feel like integration's a really big, complicated problem, as only Gartner can do. But the reason that I like this is because it does showcase some interesting areas about this domain convergence. You've got federation, which I'll be talking about in a minute. You've got your kind of traditional B2B, but again, there's an implication here, which is that, yes, the way I interact with my trading partners might change for now, but as I'm moving the core apps, my ERP and other things out to the cloud, the way I manage those trading relationships is going to change. Conversely, as I have multiple things running in the cloud, I now have a direct cloud-to-cloud connectivity option, which lowers my IT footprint even more and allows me to get a lot more agility with my current resources. And then, of course, we continue to see on-prem traditional app-to-app integration, certainly not going away anytime soon. But you can kind of see the landscape of how things are kind of evolving. So let's dig in a little bit to one of these areas now, and this kind of brings us to the next trend, which is the notion of how you enable an intelligent and a real-time business. We've been talking about real-time for a while, but I'm going to speak to specifically around the integration part of that. I tried really, really hard when I was creating this to use the phrase big data. I couldn't do it. I was at the keyboard. I tried to type it in, but I couldn't. So that was as close as I got. But I'm not going to talk to you about big data, and I'm sure there's a lot of smart people here who will. But I'm going to talk about what does it mean from an integration perspective, because data volumes are exploding. And that is, how do you actually move that data? That data is originating somewhere. It needs to end up somewhere else. There needs to be some value add put onto that data from an analytical perspective. And how do you do that? The brief history lesson here is, again, that legacy apps, way back in the day, were very poor at being able to give you large extracts out of their data stores. And being able to do delta queries, so get me just what's changed. And so this whole market of ETL emerged, which were products that specialized in being good at that and being able to read a huge bulk data set out of that legacy data store, do some work to it and load it. And they were designed to run in a batch mode, so typically at night when we go home, so that we don't impact the performance of these legacy apps. We run these ETL jobs, we get the data out, and then we do our BI work down the road from there. So these products were built and optimized at dealing with that, and they're typically dealing with data versus interacting directly with applications. So typically dealing with databases. Many of these ETL solutions have gotten very good at very natively understanding the databases, the data files underneath them, the logs that dictate changes to that data, et cetera. And what's happening now is that paradigm's completely changing, right? And the first reason it's changing is because we don't need to capture the data in batches anymore, because the data sources that we're getting and loading into these environments are coming from real-time streams. It's a stream approach versus a batch approach. A lot of people talk about capturing social interactions as a means of providing more intelligence about your customer, right? Well, you get that information from Twitter and Facebook, and you get that information in real time. You don't run a job at night and get, terabytes of data. You get it constantly throughout the day. So the data size is growing, but the way you get the data and move it is the part that's changing. And that's the intricacy that I would suggest is one of the really big impacts that cloud's having in this domain. Cloud data sources don't have databases. You can't write SQL queries against them. The databases are multi-tenant. They're sitting underneath an application layer that has a services-oriented means of interrogating that data in a multi-tenant way, meaning that you authenticate as your customer, so you get just your slice of that data. And so traditional ETL, because of this, has to be fundamentally rethought. The next one is around federated integration. So there are major trends that are decentralizing the IT landscape. The first one's been going on for a while, and that's global expansion. The second one that's kind of related to that is M&A. So as you acquire companies, those companies have their own IT, their own back office systems, and at least for some period of time, those continue to run as is. And so you need to integrate them. And third, cloud. And cloud has the most profound impact on decentralizing our IT environment, which is a good thing, because what we're doing with cloud is we're relying on our vendor to provide the SLA, to provide the security, to provide the upgrades, to ensure our customizations continue to work after we upgrade. So that's a good thing. But it means that that application, from an administrative standpoint, no longer sits on our footprint, on our data center. It sits somewhere else. And cloud will have the most profound and the most long-lived impact around decentralization. And so, again, brief history, traditional middleware was built with the one big hub model. If you go and look at any traditional EAI suite or middleware environment, they're all built around the notion that you create this big hub, and you're going to be routing and piping all your data through that big hub. And the more things decentralize, the more inefficient that becomes. IDEs were deployed to the end user workstations, and in those workstations, then we develop our integrations, and then some separate source control system sitting somewhere else captures all the configuration about those integration jobs and allows us then to manage change control. So those are all environments that have to be managed by IT today. But most important part is that one big hub model, right? That one big hub model immediately breaks when you start thinking about this federation problem. How do I address connectivity to things that are running in different places, in different data centers, in different clouds? So the hub model has to be rethought. Integration always needs to run near the sources that it's integrating. The more that integration sits away from a network latency perspective, the fundamental limitations you're going to have around how to get that integration to be performant, particularly if that integration is sitting in between a business process that you expect to be rapid, fast, very responsive. You need to, that middleware architecture needs to be thought. So the net is that the traditional middleware, like traditional ETL, must be fundamentally rethought. The way that we deploy integration has to be rethought. And then the final theme is similar to the third one, but talks about Not the hub itself now, but the actual, how do we develop these things and how do we audit them? How do we manage compliance? So this decentralization theme that I mentioned before puts the spotlight on, from an audit and compliance perspective, on our dev processes and our integration architecture. Because integration is now the thing that's actually moving the data outside the firewall. So immediately the spotlight gets shifted to those integration processes, much more than traditionally, where if your integration is sitting behind your firewall, then you've got your kind of domain of control from a security and compliance perspective. So that kind of changes. The other thing too that happens is data privacy laws vary wildly by country. There's almost zero regard to try to have countries agree with each other or even use the same language in how they talk about how data is stored and transmitted and encrypted. So again, forcing the hand on decentralization through that global expansion. CIOs that are trying to get their arms around their IT are dealing with SaaS vendors rejoicing in the ability to sell around IT and being able to go right to the line of business owners and sell them CRM or marketing or HR systems. And the CIOs in a lot of cases don't even know it happened. And, but we're still on the hook from a data compliance privacy perspective, right? So, you know, the line of business went and bought and solved their Salesforce automation problem, but that customer data is being transmitted outside the firewall. So the bill still comes back to the CIO to solve the problem. And that's a really, there's a lot of surveys around just how pervasive that problem really is. Because I think it is a problem, right? I think it's a little bit short-sighted to think that you can just sort of work around IT forever. Because at the end of the day, you know, IT is a service to the business, and IT is making sure that data is actually being protected and encrypted. And so companies require a central point of control, and CIOs are probably the groups that are up at night most about this, but they need a central point of control for how integration gets developed, how you manage ops around your integration lifecycle, and then how you handle change control and maintenance of those integrations. So those are kind of the big themes. One of the interesting use cases, and I've got two customers that I'll talk through that so you can kind of hear it from their perspective. The One World Airline Alliance is always a great one. I don't know, maybe this isn't a good one to be opening with because it's somewhat complicated, but the problem they're trying to solve isn't that complicated. So basically, you know, any of us in this room that are members of One World, if we fly, you know, British Airways, we want to get credited back to our One World account for that transaction, that flight. So the One World members were solving this problem traditionally point to point. So kind of a neat illustration, their illustration, when they're building their business case to justify, you know, bringing in a cloud model to solve this. You know, they showed the impact of point-to-point, right? The exponential complexity as you add each new airline to the alliance. Every airline has to learn how to connect back to that new member airline and vice versa. And it's a problem that grows exponentially as you add more members. With the hub model from a development perspective, they can collaborate on one kind of global format for what a frequent flyer event looks like. So that's what they ended up doing. The other interesting thing about their problem was being global airlines, they are representing 14 different countries with 14 different data privacy and compliance laws. And so the reason why I said it's maybe not the best example is that's a really extreme case of companies having to work collaboratively on solving data privacy and compliance. But it's still a neat story, I think, because most of us can relate to the need to have our miles collected appropriately if we travel a lot. And so I think it's kind of a good story from that perspective. And you know, they're able to, you know, each member airline logs into one central development environment. They have one global format for a frequent flyer transaction. They can exchange that with the other member airline. They can test collaboratively together. So really has taken them forward in how they add members to their airlines and how they manage connectivity to each other. And then finally, I thought I'd talk about a customer that was, I would describe as sort of fairly cloud forward and how they think about their IT strategy. Because I really like the way they talk about where they were and where they are now. And they kind of touch on a couple of the different themes that you heard me mention. So it's a company called Penasus, and Penasus provides high-performance parallel storage for organizations in several different verticals. They're a global sales organization. They outsource all their manufacturing, so they work with contract manufacturers. And they're growing very rapidly. They had no formal integration. They had a lot of outdated systems. They had a lot of custom-coded systems. They had sort of piecemealed together their integration. They had a small technical staff, limited IT budget, which is a very familiar kind of story, and brought in some new leadership to sort of change that norm and really move them forward and advance them. And the new leadership felt that a cloud strategy was the way to get them there. And I'll be very specific in what I mean by a cloud strategy. This is where they were, and what you aren't seeing is what they had before that they sunset or moved. But they had one thing remaining on premise. They continue to use Microsoft Dynamics, but in a hosted private cloud. They use a hosted private cloud environment for their Microsoft Exchange server, and then Cisco and BlackBerry for their unified communications. And then from a public cloud perspective, Salesforce.com for their Salesforce automation, big machines for their contract management, Marketo for marketing automation, Concur for expense management, Coupa for procurement, and GoToMeeting for online collaboration. So their critical integrations, and they're off-premise, so they're contract manufacturer. So again, they develop the specs, the requirements, they ship that off to a manufacturer in China that actually builds the actual physical devices for them. So the critical integrations for them are how they manage converting their closed-won opportunities into sales orders and invoices, how they take, when an order is closed, that triggers a communication to the contract manufacturer to say, ship this thing to this location, how they manage expenses and load those expenses back into the ERP, and then as their procurements, as they're buying from their suppliers, how to turn those into invoices inside their ERP. So those are sort of their key kind of focus areas. This is the one slide that actually talks about the company that I work for. So I'll sort of keep it brief. But what they were looking for is a cloud-based approach to solving integration, because as you saw, they were dealing with a very cloud-centric IT strategy. They wanted the notion of immediate access, so the notion of a free trial, which is something that a lot of cloud service providers offer, so that they could log in and begin trying it. They logged in and on their own built their first integration in 3 days. I wouldn't say it was production ready, but they got it working. It mimicked what was already running in production in 3 days. So they were immediately sold on the time to value message. And they really liked the notion of the, in the time to value theme, what they're calling their quick ramp up. So, not having to do the administrative management of hardware, pre-built connectors for all the apps they wanted to connect, so they didn't have to learn those APIs. And they had a on-premise deployment option, so they had an agent, a runtime engine that could be deployed to run remotely. And subscription-based pricing, which is kind of table stakes with cloud services, but they're able to increase their investment in Boomi based on the number of things they want to connect and integrate. So it kind of made sense for them as they're growing over time. This is one business process. So again, it's an eye chart, and I'm not going to read through it, but this is meant to illustrate the complexity involved in how this actually comes together and works. And you'll notice that you are bridging here, going back to our theme, a hosted private cloud ERP environment, a public cloud CRM environment, public cloud contract management, and on-premise system that does the MRP, the material resource planning component, right? So you've got 3 different domains being connected and integrated, and so for them, being able to have that centralized control is what's really important. And actually, a fourth, because there's also a B2B notion. They're exchanging EDI with that contract manufacturer. So in just one business process, right, they're having to do and mediate a lot of different interaction styles and schemes and connectivity patterns. So I think it's kind of a great example of that decentralization at work. And these guys aren't even that big. I mean, we're talking about 1,000 employee company. So some of their lessons learned as they went into this, they quickly realized the difference between something I didn't talk about today, but master data management, which is how do you keep a unified copy of the nouns of your business, your customer, your employee, your vendor, your contacts, consistent across all your applications versus data movement or data synchronization. And so they've developed some disciplines in understanding when to solve what. They sat down and thought through standards in advance of actually building. So they sat down and modeled their systems of record. They sat down and modeled their data definitions, what had to run in a batch mode, what could run in a real-time mode. They engaged their partners early, so these are their contract manufacturers. So they engaged them early to collaborate with them on their technical formats and standards, things like that. They got very sophisticated in change management and controls. Again, they were coming from an environment where that really wasn't formal. It was pretty, I guess you'd kind of call it ad hoc, basically, but they had put formal controls in place through implementing these apps and through working with companies like Boomi. So they quickly understand how do you actually roll out production changes to integrations in a way that doesn't impact your business processes. They put a lot of energy around error trapping, error handling. This is one of those things when companies have been doing a custom code strategy, so custom coding their integration together. One of their big pain points that isn't thought about when you're writing that code is error handling. Usually, custom code projects, you're focused on just connecting the 2 apps together. And you're not as focused on how do I capture errors and segregate them between what's a bad data error versus what's an error that actually is systemic or related to the actual middleware itself. And of course, documentation. So it's a good example of a company that very quickly over the span of 2 years, revamped their IT, moved to a very cloud-centric strategy, and matured the processes around how they govern their IT environment. So I think it's a good story. So that was really it. Again, I really wanted to introduce you guys to some of the concepts around how cloud impacts traditional integration, and then give you some real kind of customer use cases, customer stories to kind of get you thinking about it. So we've got plenty of time for questions. Be more than happy to take them at this time. Yeah, please.
Yeah, last night I was talking to a military IT and network specialist who gave me the furrowed brow on the cloud security question. And he said, if you don't control a public cloud, what are you going to do about stuff like compromise of your provider's software compromise of your provider's employees. I didn't have an answer for it.
Yeah. There's definitely some vertical industry variance in their likelihood of cloud. You know, when you look at the federal space, the mandate they've been given by the federal, the Fed CTO, is a cloud-first IT strategy. So any application or service that's being brought into the federal domain, you should opt for a cloud service first, and if you need to back to on-prem, back to on-prem. But with that said, a lot of standards and compliance are most rigid and most inflexible in a lot of those domains. The way that you're required to demonstrate the location of your data, how it's encrypted, kind of fundamentally rules out a multi-tenant type of architecture. So there's sort of blocking and tackling problems that exist, but I think it's a mentality shift, it's a philosophy shift more than it is there a real exposure or a real threat. You know, in reality, multi-tenant architectures actually have a smaller risk exposure than a larger, because the vendors that are architecting these multi-tenant environments have complete control over the access points to those environments and the exposure to those environments. And it is their existence, it is their life, literally, to make sure that those environments are not compromised. When most of those federal customers that I just spoke about were audited over, I think it was a 2011 report, the problems that were found were very, very simple problems. Password reset policies not being enforced, password complexity and length not being enforced. And so it's a little tongue-in-cheek when there's sort of very basic security issues that exist, and we're focusing on the notion of, how do I sort of protect against, vendor vulnerabilities. So a lot of it comes down to trust. A lot of it comes down to, changing or shifting a paradigm thinking. And there's a ton of that's going to continue to exist, I think. And that's sort of probably common with any kind of disruptive change, I think. But I think it's a pretty yeah.
So that you're saying that really if the cloud weren't new, the vulnerabilities wouldn't look larger.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a fundamental trust issue of something that is viewed as not as proven as approaches or practices that have been around for 15 years or more. When in reality, those practices, led us to that slide that I showed in my second slide. Yeah.
So is Boomi the product that helps with these integrations? Is that what you mentioned?
Yeah. So we are one of the middleware options, that has taken the approach of trying to focus on the types of themes you heard me talk about, and building a cloud service that sort of fundamentally is thinking about those themes as core part of our product. Any other questions? Yeah.
So would you say Boomi might be a good idea where you have in-house processes, you have your own in-house middleware dealing with your own in-house web services on one end and data on the other end that are kind of complex, homegrown, baked in, kind of tangled, and you maybe tease out just that middleware component and either just rebuild it from scratch or take a look at different at integrating it or extracting the data?
Yeah, absolutely. We will typically start by augmenting or complementing that current middleware, and over time moving those integrations over to our offering so that they can be managed in a more scalable manner. What I mean by that is, you can get out of that point-to-point model and focus more on publishing services, consuming services, and then orchestrating between the services. And so over time, companies will tend to shift more and more. Maybe there's some application project where you're doing a big upgrade, modernizing an app, bringing on a new app. That will typically trigger an integration project. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, thanks, Rick. So ahead of those integration projects, when you're moving from a legacy system to the cloud, is the data migration often, there's a large amount of data that needs to move into that system so that it can then work in the cloud. Are there any silver bullets or any future hope for improving that capability?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people will look at data migration as a kind of a really big version of an integration problem. And typically, data migration is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to clean up your data as you're moving it versus moving it steady state. And so we see a lot of customers that move it steady state, and the value they get out of the new app they're moving to gets kind of fundamentally limited because they're moving duplicated data or incomplete data. So usually we recommend that's not a manual process in terms of actually moving the data, but providing plenty of workflow capability for the team to clean up their respective data sets while it's in transit. So out of the source system, clean up while it's in transit, and then load it in to the new application. So it's a people-centric process, but I think it's a one-time type of thing. So and it represents an opportunity for the teams, the business owners of that data, to get their data in a state that lets you start on the right path with the app you're moving to.
Yeah, I work in the pharma space, and there's often a requirement for 7 or more years to keep the data. So there's some opportunity to clean it, but there's still potentially a lot of data that has to go, and it's very painful to get it through those APIs instead of just dumping it in a database. So.
Yeah. SaaS vendors are starting to provide some new options to help with that, but I'd say we're sort of very early on. So Salesforce.com has a whole separate API now called their bulk API that's designed for loading large amounts of data asynchronously. So most of the APIs you deal with are very synchronous, transactionally oriented. So yeah, to move 7 years worth, it's gonna take you weeks and weeks and weeks. So these bulk APIs help by allowing you to move in large batches, and then the service on the other end over a period of time works on the data, and so it's a much more efficient approach. So we're starting to see more cloud providers move that way, but I think particularly as cloud adoption is continuing to move up market, that problem is, bigger companies have more data. So it's driving the vendors to get their act together there. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks again for your time, everyone. Appreciate it.